For most of human history, the human body learned to sleep without ever leaving the ground. There was no fixed surface waiting at night, no raised place designed for rest, no stable comfort repeated from one day to the next. Sleep happened directly on Earth that could be cold, uneven, or alive with movement. What feels natural today, a bed, a mattress, a controlled space, is not something the human body originally required. It is something that appeared much later. If humans spent most of their existence resting this way, then what changed when the ground was finally left behind? And what might have quietly disappeared with it? Why 90% of human history never had a bed? Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video, because the knowledge ahead may quietly change how you understand your own sleep. For most of human history, sleep was not something that happened in a place prepared in advance, and it was not something that waited at the end of a predictable routine. It emerged wherever the body finally slowed down enough, often in spaces that were still part of the same environment where the day had unfolded. There was no clear separation between where a person moved, ate, watched, and where they eventually lay down. The idea of a fixed sleeping location, something that belongs to an individual and remains unchanged across nights, is a relatively recent development. If we look back to earlier periods of human existence, especially before permanent settlements became common, the conditions were shaped by movement. Groups followed food sources, water, and seasonal changes. In that context, carrying or constructing a consistent sleeping structure was not always practical. What remained consistent was not the place, but the act of finding a moment of rest within changing surroundings. This suggests that the human body became accustomed not to a specific surface, but to variability itself. The ground could be firm or soft, dry or damp, warm from the day, or cooling rapidly after sunset. Each of these conditions would influence how the body positioned itself, how long it stayed still, and how deeply it could rest. There is no strong evidence that early humans had standardized sleeping arrangements across all environments. Instead, archaeological traces such as hearth locations, scattered plant remains, and repeated occupation layers suggest temporary use of space rather than permanent sleeping zones. In some cases, there are indications that natural materials like grass or leaves may have been gathered, possibly to create a slightly more insulated surface, but even these would not have formed a stable, repeatable bed in the modern sense. They would decay, shift, or be abandoned as groups moved on. The absence of a fixed place for sleep also meant that the timing and structure of rest could remain flexible. Without artificial light and without enclosed, controlled environments, human activity followed the rhythm of daylight and darkness more closely. Yet even within that rhythm, sleep may not have always been a single, uninterrupted block. Environmental sounds, temperature changes, and the need for awareness would likely shape lighter and more fragmented patterns of rest. This does not mean that sleep was necessarily worse, but it suggests that it was integrated into a different kind of daily experience, one that did not isolate the body from its surroundings. If we consider how modern sleep is often tied to a specific location, a bed in a room, in a house, in a fixed position, it becomes clear that this structure creates a boundary that did not always exist. The body today often expects that boundary, associating a particular surface and environment with the act of sleeping. But for a very long time, that association may not have been necessary. Instead, the ability to sleep may have depended more on internal conditions than external setup. Fatigue, safety, and opportunity would have played a larger role than comfort in the modern sense. This raises an important perspective on the original conditions of human rest. Sleep did not belong to a place. It happened within a landscape that was constantly shifting, and the body adjusted each time. When we imagine early humans lying down, it is not on something designed for them, but within a setting that was never fully controlled. The absence of a bed was not a missing object. It was part of a broader pattern where stability itself was limited, and where rest had to exist alongside uncertainty rather than apart from it. And in that context, the question of why humans did not have beds becomes less about invention and more about necessity, because a fixed place to sleep only becomes meaningful when life itself begins to stay still. As movement shaped where people could rest, it also shaped how space itself was understood. There was no clear idea of a sleeping area separated from everything else. The same ground that held footprints during the day could become the place where bodies settled at night. Fire might mark a temporary center, offering warmth and a small degree of protection, but even this did not create a fixed boundary. It shifted with each camp, each pause, each change in direction. The absence of a stable location meant that sleep remained closely tied to whatever conditions were present at that moment, rather than to any prepared environment. This suggests that early human rest was not built around expectation, but around adaptation. When the body lay down, it did not encounter something familiar and repeated. It encountered variation, and over time, it adjusted to that variation as a normal condition rather than an exception. If the ground was uneven, the body found a position that reduced strain. If it was cold, the body conserved heat through posture or proximity to others. If the surface carried small movements whined through grass, subtle shifts of soil, those became part of the sensory field of rest, not something removed from it. In this way, the experience of sleep may have remained connected to awareness rather than separated from it. There is no clear evidence that early humans always sought out the most comfortable possible surface. Instead, they likely balanced multiple factors: visibility, access to fire, protection from wind, and distance from potential threats. A place that was slightly less comfortable but offered a better view of the surroundings might be chosen over a softer but more exposed area. This reinforces the idea that sleep was not organized primarily around comfort. It was organized around survival within a landscape that could not be fully controlled. Over long periods of time, this kind of decision-making would shape not only behavior, but also the expectations of the body itself. Rather than waiting for an ideal condition, rest would occur when conditions were sufficient. This difference is subtle, but important. In modern settings, sleep is often delayed until the environment meets certain standards: a stable surface, controlled temperature, reduced noise. In earlier conditions, those standards were rarely available in a consistent way. The threshold for rest may have been lower, not because the body required less, but because the environment offered less predictability. This also changes how we think about repetition. A bed today provides continuity. It allows the body to return to the same position, the same support, the same orientation each night. In contrast, a moving lifestyle would disrupt that continuity. Each night could involve a different surface, a different slope, a different relationship to fire, wind, or other people. Over time, this lack of repetition may have influenced how the body distributed pressure, how it shifted during sleep, and how it responded to minor discomforts. Instead of relying on a fixed support, the body itself became more active in adjusting to the surface beneath it. Archaeological traces do not show consistent, long-term structures dedicated solely to sleep in early periods. Instead, what appears are layers of occupation, small changes in soil composition, fragments of organic material, and signs of repeated but temporary use. These traces point toward flexibility rather than permanence. They suggest that sleep was embedded within a broader pattern of living that did not isolate one activity from another. Even when groups returned to similar locations across seasons, the exact conditions would still change. Vegetation grows or disappears, soil shifts, weather alters the landscape. The idea of recreating the exact same sleeping condition night after night would not have been practical. This reinforces a broader pattern. The human body learned to rest without relying on a fixed place, and without expecting the environment to remain stable. When we look at this from a distance, it becomes clearer that the absence of beds was not simply due to a lack of tools or materials. It was tied to a way of living in which stability itself was limited. A bed, as we understand it today, depends on repetition, on staying in one place long enough for a surface to become familiar and meaningful. Without that stability, the concept of a bed does not fully take shape. Instead, rest remains something that moves with the body, adjusting each time the landscape changes. Over time, this pattern of moving, pausing, and resting without a fixed place would shape not only behavior, but also the way the human body related to the idea of stability itself. When there is no repeated surface, no permanent sleeping location, the body does not build a strong expectation that rest must happen in a specific way. Instead, it becomes accustomed to entering sleep under conditions that are only partly controlled. The ground might feel different each night, the surrounding sounds might shift, the temperature might change gradually across the dark hours. These variations would not stand out as disruptions in the same way they might today, because they were part of the normal range of experience. In this sense, the absence of a bed is not just about lacking an object. It reflects a broader relationship between the body and its environment, where rest remains connected to external conditions rather than separated from them. If we follow this idea further back to the early stages of human development, when our ancestors were still adapting to life on varied terrain, the ability to rest without fixed support may have been an advantage rather than a limitation. A body that can settle on uneven ground, adjust its posture without assistance, and maintain a level of awareness, even while resting, would be more flexible in unpredictable environments. There is no clear evidence that early humans experienced sleep in exactly the same way as modern humans do, but there are indications from both comparative studies and environmental reconstructions that rest was likely lighter, more responsive, and more closely tied to surroundings. This does not mean it was less effective, but it suggests that the structure of sleep was integrated into a different kind of daily rhythm. Without walls, without enclosed rooms, and without controlled surfaces, the boundary between the body and the outside world remained thinner. This thin boundary is important when thinking about why a bed did not emerge earlier. A bed requires not only materials and tools, but also a shift in how space is organized. It assumes that there is a designated area for rest, separate from other activities, and that this area will remain stable over time. But in a context where people move frequently, where the same ground is rarely used in exactly the same way, that kind of separation does not easily develop. Even when natural shelters such as caves or rock overhangs were used, they did not necessarily create a permanent sleeping arrangement. The interior space might offer some protection from weather, but the ground inside would still be subject to change, and the use of that space could vary depending on the group, the season, and the conditions. Archaeological findings sometimes reveal layers of ash, charred material, and compacted surfaces that suggest repeated use of certain areas, yet these do not clearly indicate the presence of a structured bed. Instead, they point to places where people gathered, rested, and then moved on again. The idea of building something solely for sleep appears later, alongside more stable patterns of living. When groups begin to remain in one place for longer periods, when the effort of shaping the environment can be maintained across time, then the concept of preparing a surface specifically for rest becomes more meaningful. Before that shift, the body itself carries most of the responsibility for adapting to the ground. It adjusts its position, distributes weight, and responds to discomfort in small, continuous ways. This ongoing adjustment may be one reason why rest did not depend on a fixed structure. The flexibility of the body reduced the need for a consistent external support. When we look at the present, where a bed often represents comfort, privacy, and routine, it is easy to assume that such a structure is a natural extension of human needs. But when we step back into a longer timeline, it becomes clear that this is not the original condition. For a very long time, rest existed without that structure, and the body adapted to that absence as a normal state. The emergence of the bed, therefore, marks not just a technological change, but a deeper shift in how humans began to separate themselves from the variability of the environment. And understanding that shift requires looking not only at what was gained, but also at what the body had already learned to do before that separation ever began. When the human body lowers itself to rest, the first point of contact has almost always been the ground. Long before any constructed surface existed, the body met soil, sand, grass, stone, or compacted earth shaped by time and weather. This contact was not occasional. It was repeated across generations, across climates, and across different stages of human development. The ground was not simply a background to human life. It was the default surface against which the body learned to distribute weight, to release tension, and to remain still for extended periods. In this sense, the relationship between the human body and the ground is not incidental. It is foundational, formed over a span of time much longer than the period in which raised sleeping surfaces have existed. If we consider how the body settles when lying down without any support beyond what is naturally present, certain patterns begin to emerge. The spine does not align in a perfectly straight line, but follows the contours of the surface beneath it. Pressure is distributed unevenly, shifting slightly as the body adjusts. Muscles do not fully disengage at once, but release gradually as balance is found. These small adjustments are continuous, often subtle enough not to interrupt rest, yet constant enough to shape how the body experiences stillness. In environments where the ground changes from place to place, these adjustments would also change, reinforcing a kind of adaptability rather than reliance on a single, repeated condition. There is no clear evidence that early humans required a flat, soft, or stable surface to achieve rest. Instead, the variety of terrains in which human remains and activity traces are found suggests that rest occurred across a wide range of conditions. From open plains to forest floors, from rocky outcrops to sandy areas, the ground itself provided the only consistent interface between the body and the environment. In some archaeological contexts, there are signs that natural materials such as leaves or grasses may have been gathered, possibly to create a layer between the body and the soil. However, these layers would have been temporary, subject to decay, movement, and abandonment. They did not create a permanent separation from the ground, but rather a thin and shifting extension of it. This distinction is important because it suggests that even when efforts were made to modify the surface, the body remained closely connected to the underlying terrain. The concept of being off the ground did not yet fully exist. The body was still within the same thermal and physical conditions as the surrounding environment. Temperature changes in the soil could be felt directly. Small movements in the surface, whether from wind or other subtle shifts, could transfer through the body. This level of contact may have influenced not only physical posture, but also the way the body calibrated its sense of balance and orientation during rest. Over long periods, repeated exposure to these conditions would shape expectations. The body would not anticipate a consistent level of softness or support. Instead, it would remain responsive, making ongoing adjustments as needed. This responsiveness may help explain why a fixed, elevated surface was not immediately necessary. The ground, in its variability, was already sufficient. It provided enough support for rest to occur, even if that support was not uniform. As human groups moved through different environments, the body carried with it the ability to adapt to each new surface without requiring a constructed solution. This does not mean that all surfaces were equally suitable. Some conditions would have been avoided when possible, such as excessively wet ground or areas with unstable footing. Yet even within these limits, the range of acceptable surfaces was broad. The absence of a bed, therefore, was not simply due to a lack of knowledge or materials. It reflected a situation in which the existing conditions were already functional. The ground met the basic requirements for rest, and the body was capable of working with what it provided. When we compare this to the modern expectation of a bed, where the surface is designed to reduce pressure points and maintain a consistent shape, the difference becomes clear. Today, the surface adapts to the body. In earlier conditions, the body adapted to the surface. This reversal marks a significant shift, but it is a shift that occurs relatively late in the timeline of human history. For the majority of that timeline, the ground remained the primary interface for rest, and the human body developed in constant relationship with it. Understanding this relationship is central to understanding why beds did not appear earlier, because before a new surface is created, the existing one must first become insufficient. And for a very long time, the ground was not insufficient. It was simply the way things were. When the body rests directly on the ground, it does not encounter a uniform surface that remains unchanged from one moment to the next. Instead, it meets a surface that carries subtle variations, small slopes, scattered textures, areas of compression and release. These variations do not disappear when the body becomes still. They continue to interact with it, shaping how weight is distributed and how long a position can be maintained before a shift becomes necessary. In this way, the ground does not simply support the body, it engages with it, requiring ongoing adjustment rather than passive stillness. This interaction may appear minor at any given moment, but over long periods of time, repeated exposure to such conditions would influence how the body manages rest. Muscles do not remain completely inactive, and joints are not held in a single fixed alignment for extended durations. Instead, there is a gradual pattern of micro-movements, small changes in posture that reduce pressure and restore circulation. These movements can occur without full awakening, allowing rest to continue while the body adapts to the surface beneath it. There is no clear evidence that early humans consciously managed these adjustments, but the physical conditions suggest that such responses would naturally emerge. If we consider environments where the ground retains heat from the day or cools rapidly after sunset, the body would also respond to these thermal changes. Contact with the surface allows heat exchange to occur more directly than it would on a raised structure. As the temperature shifts, the body may adjust its position, reducing exposure to colder areas or seeking parts of the ground that remain warmer. This continuous exchange reinforces the idea that rest was not isolated from environmental conditions, but remained closely connected to them. In contrast, a bed in a modern setting often acts as a buffer. It reduces direct contact with the ground, stabilizes temperature around the body, and minimizes the need for constant adjustment. While this creates a more consistent experience, it also changes the relationship between the body and its surroundings. In earlier conditions, the ground provided feedback that the body responded to in real time. In a controlled environment, much of that feedback is reduced or delayed. Archaeological findings provide indirect support for this pattern. In sites where human presence is indicated by repeated use, such as areas around hearths, the ground often shows signs of compaction. This suggests that bodies return to similar locations, yet even in these cases, the surface would not remain unchanged. Ash layers accumulate and disperse, organic materials decompose, and soil structure shifts with use and weather. The result is not a fixed platform, but a surface that evolves over time. Resting on such a surface would require the body to continually recalibrate, rather than relying on a consistent form. This ongoing recalibration may help explain why a fully stable, elevated surface was not an immediate necessity. The body was already capable of managing variability, and the ground, despite its imperfections, provided sufficient support for rest to occur. From a longer historical perspective, this suggests that the introduction of beds represents a shift away from a dynamic interaction toward a more controlled one. Instead of adapting to each surface, the body begins to expect a surface that remains predictable. This expectation builds over time, reinforced by repetition. When the same bed is used night after night, the body becomes accustomed to its shape, its firmness, and its height above the ground. The need for continuous adjustment decreases, and rest becomes associated with stability rather than variability. Yet this stability is not the original condition. For most of human history, rest unfolded on a surface that was never exactly the same twice. The ground required attention, even in stillness, and the body responded with subtle, ongoing movement. This pattern does not suggest that early sleep was necessarily less effective, but it highlights a different form of balance, one that depended on flexibility rather than uniform support. Understanding this difference brings us closer to the central question, because the absence of a bed is not simply about lacking a constructed object. It reflects a period in which the interaction between body and surface remained active, variable, and directly tied to the conditions of the natural world. Over long periods of time, repeated contact with the ground would not only shape how the body rested, but also what it came to expect from rest itself. When a surface is never entirely predictable, the body does not rely on a single position or a fixed alignment to remain comfortable. Instead, it develops a broader range of acceptable positions, each one adapted to slightly different conditions. This range becomes part of the body's normal function. Rather than seeking a perfect surface, the body becomes capable of finding rest within imperfect ones. In this context, discomfort is not always a signal to stop resting, but part of a spectrum that the body can adjust within. This distinction becomes clearer when we consider how the body distributes pressure during sleep. On a consistent, engineered surface, pressure points are minimized through uniform support. On the ground, pressure varies depending on texture and shape. Small areas may carry more weight than others, leading the body to shift gradually. These shifts do not necessarily interrupt sleep completely, but they create a pattern of movement that remains integrated into rest. Over time, such patterns could influence how muscles release tension and how circulation is maintained during stillness. The body, in effect, remains slightly active even while resting, responding to the conditions beneath it rather than remaining entirely passive. This pattern also extends to how the body perceives stability. A bed offers a defined boundary. It has edges, a consistent height, and a predictable surface. The ground, by contrast, does not present a clear limit. It extends in all directions, changing gradually rather than abruptly. When the body rests on such a surface, its sense of orientation is not anchored to a fixed structure, but to the surrounding environment. The slope of the land, the direction of the wind, and the position of nearby elements all contribute to how the body situates itself. This broader spatial awareness may remain present even during rest, creating a different relationship between the body and the space it occupies. From an archaeological perspective, there is little indication that early humans consistently modified the ground into a standardized sleeping platform. While there are signs of repeated use in certain locations, such as flattened areas near hearths, these do not show the uniformity associated with constructed beds. Instead, they suggest that the ground was used as it was found, with only minimal adjustment when necessary. Organic materials might have been added temporarily, but these additions would not create a lasting structure. They would shift, decompose, or be replaced as conditions changed. This reinforces the idea that the body did not depend on a fixed surface to achieve rest. It worked with what was available, adjusting continuously rather than seeking consistency. When we consider how this long period of adaptation compares to the relatively recent introduction of raised sleeping surfaces, the contrast becomes more pronounced. A bed represents a stable, repeatable condition. It reduces variation, limits the need for adjustment, and separates the body from direct contact with the ground. While this provides comfort and predictability, it also narrows the range of conditions the body regularly experiences during rest. Over time, this narrowing may influence what the body comes to expect. Positions that once felt acceptable may now feel uncomfortable, not because the body has changed entirely, but because its expectations have shifted through repetition. This shift does not imply that one form of rest is inherently better than the other. It highlights a transition from variability to consistency, from adaptation to reliance. For most of human history, the ground remained sufficient. It provided the necessary support, even if that support required continuous adjustment. The absence of a bed, therefore, reflects a period in which the body was not dependent on a fixed structure to rest. It could enter sleep within a wide range of conditions, responding to the surface beneath it in real time. Understanding this helps clarify why beds did not appear earlier, because before a consistent surface becomes necessary, the body must first lose its ability to adapt to inconsistency. And for a very long time, that ability remained intact. In environments where early humans lived, the conditions that shaped sleep were not designed or controlled. They emerged from the interaction of climate, landscape, and time of day. Temperature could drop quickly after sunset, especially in open areas where heat dissipated without obstruction. In other regions, humidity could remain high through the night, affecting how the body retained warmth or released it. Wind might shift direction, carrying cooler air across exposed ground or moving through vegetation in ways that altered the immediate surroundings. These elements were not background details. They were active forces that influenced when, where, and how rest could occur. Without walls, insulation, or constructed barriers, the body remained directly exposed to these changes. This exposure meant that sleep was not shaped by comfort in the modern sense, but by the need to find conditions that were manageable rather than ideal. If we trace this pattern back to the earliest stages of human existence, when our ancestors inhabited varied ecosystems across Africa and later expanded into other regions, it becomes clear that there was no single environmental condition that defined sleep. Instead, there was a range of possibilities, each with its own constraints. In some areas, the ground retained warmth from the day, offering a temporary advantage during the early part of the night. In others, moisture in the soil could draw heat away from the body more quickly. The presence of insects or small animals might influence where a person chose to lie down, even if that choice came with other trade-offs, such as less shelter from wind. These decisions were not about achieving comfort as an end goal. They were about balancing multiple factors in a setting where full control was not possible. Archaeological and environmental evidence suggests that early humans often used fire as a way to modify their immediate surroundings. A fire could provide warmth, light, and a degree of deterrence against certain animals. Yet even with fire, the environment was not fully controlled. Heat from the fire decreases with distance, and maintaining it requires attention and resources. The area around a hearth might become a focal point for rest, but it would not create a stable, enclosed space in the way a modern room does. The ground near the fire would still change over time, with ash accumulating, embers shifting, and surfaces becoming compacted or uneven. This means that even in locations that were used repeatedly, the conditions of rest were not fixed. They evolved with each use, shaped by both human activity and natural processes. In this context, the absence of a bed reflects more than a lack of construction. It reflects a different relationship between the body and its environment, where rest remains embedded within external conditions rather than separated from them. The body does not wait for the environment to become comfortable. It adapts to what is present, adjusting posture, timing, and duration of rest as needed. This adaptability may have been supported by the body's ability to respond to subtle changes in temperature and pressure, allowing it to maintain rest even when conditions were not uniform. Over long periods, this pattern would reinforce a form of resilience, where sleep could occur under a wide range of circumstances. When we compare this to modern environments, where temperature is often regulated, surfaces are stabilized, and external disturbances are minimized, the contrast becomes more apparent. Today, sleep is often protected from variation. The environment is shaped to meet the needs of the body. In earlier conditions, the body met the environment as it was. This difference is central to understanding why beds did not appear earlier. A bed is part of a broader system that separates the body from environmental variability. It provides a consistent surface, often within a controlled space. But before such control becomes common, the need for that separation is not as strong. The body is already capable of functioning within variable conditions, and the environment, though unpredictable, remains sufficient. In this way, the absence of a bed is closely tied to the presence of environmental forces that remained active during rest. Sleep was not isolated from these forces. It unfolded within them, shaped by temperature, moisture, wind, and the many subtle changes that occur between sunset and sunrise. And in that setting, rest was not about eliminating variability, but about finding a way to exist within it. Beyond temperature and wind, the presence of other living organisms also shaped how and where rest could occur. The ground was not an empty surface. It carried insects, small animals, and layers of organic material that were constantly changing. In many environments, especially those with higher humidity, the density of insects increases after sunset, drawn by warmth and stillness. This would influence where a person chose to lie down, but it would not remove the interaction entirely. Even in areas selected for relative safety, contact with the surrounding life of the environment remained part of the experience of rest. This suggests that sleep was not isolated from biological activity around the body, but existed within it. The body, in turn, would respond to these conditions through small adjustments, shifting position, or choosing locations that reduced exposure without eliminating it. There is no clear evidence that early humans were able to create consistently insect-free or biologically controlled sleeping areas. Instead, they likely relied on a combination of environmental awareness and simple modifications, such as selecting drier ground, staying closer to smoke from a fire, or avoiding areas with visible signs of concentrated activity. These choices reflect a form of management rather than control. The environment could be influenced, but not fully separated from. In this context, the absence of a bed is connected to a broader absence of barriers. A raised surface can create distance between the body and what moves along the ground, but before such structures became common, that distance did not exist. The body remained part of the same layer of activity as the surrounding environment. This proximity would also affect how rest was maintained. Complete stillness for long periods may not always have been possible or desirable. Subtle movements could help reduce contact with irritants or adjust to shifting conditions. These movements might occur without full awakening, allowing rest to continue while maintaining a level of responsiveness. From a modern perspective, this might appear as a disruption, but within the conditions of earlier environments it may have been a normal pattern. Sleep, in this sense, did not require complete separation from external stimuli. It coexisted with them, maintaining a balance between rest and awareness. Archaeological evidence does not provide direct records of these interactions, but it does show that early human sites often contain traces of diverse biological activity. Layers of soil, plant remains, and signs of animal presence indicate that these spaces were shared environments rather than controlled interiors. Even in caves or sheltered areas where conditions might be more stable, there is little indication of complete separation from surrounding life. The ground inside such spaces still carried organic material, and the boundaries between interior and exterior were not sealed. This reinforces the idea that rest occurred within a living environment, not apart from it. Over time, as human groups began to settle more permanently in certain locations, the ability to modify surroundings increased. Barriers could be built, spaces could be cleared, and surfaces could be altered more deliberately. Yet even then, the transition was gradual. The development of fully separated sleeping areas required not only materials and techniques, but also a shift in how space was organized and used. Before that shift, the body remained in direct contact with the biological activity of the ground. This contact is central to understanding why beds did not appear earlier. A bed is not only a surface, it is also a form of separation, lifting the body away from what exists at ground level. Without the means or the need to create that separation, rest remained embedded within the same layer of activity as the environment itself. When we look at this from a broader perspective, it becomes clear that sleep in early human history was shaped by multiple interacting factors, not by a single condition. Temperature, terrain, and biological presence all contributed to a setting in which rest had to be flexible and responsive. The absence of a bed reflects this complexity. It is not simply that humans lacked a constructed surface, but that their relationship with the environment did not yet require one. Sleep remained connected to the ground, to the life within it, and to the constant changes that defined the natural world. And within that connection, the body learned to rest without ever fully separating itself from what surrounded it. As these environmental forces, temperature, wind, and the presence of other living organisms continued to shape the conditions of rest, they also influenced the timing and depth of sleep itself. Without controlled lighting or enclosed spaces, the transition from day to night was gradual, marked by fading light and cooling air rather than a clear boundary. This gradual shift meant that the body did not always move abruptly from full wakefulness into a deep, isolated state of sleep. Instead, there may have been periods of reduced activity, moments of stillness, and phases of lighter rest before deeper sleep occurred. These transitions would be influenced by what the environment allowed at that moment. A sudden drop in temperature, a change in wind direction, or increased activity from nearby animals could delay or interrupt rest, not as an exception, but as part of the normal pattern. In this setting, sleep was not a single, uninterrupted block secured by stable conditions. It was something that unfolded in layers, shaped by external changes that remained active throughout the night. This layered structure suggests that the body maintained a degree of responsiveness even during rest. Rather than fully disconnecting from its surroundings, it remained capable of reacting to shifts in the environment. This does not mean that sleep was shallow in a constant sense, but that its depth could vary over time, adjusting to conditions as they changed. In contrast, modern environments often aim to eliminate these variations, creating a space where temperature remains stable, light is minimized, and external disturbances are reduced. A bed, placed within such an environment, becomes part of a system designed to protect sleep from interruption, but in earlier conditions, interruption was not entirely avoidable, and the body adapted by integrating it into the overall pattern of rest. Archaeological and anthropological observations support the idea that early human activity did not always follow a strict division between day and night. Evidence of repeated use of certain sites suggests that people may have remained intermittently active after sunset, tending fires, maintaining awareness, or responding to changes in the environment. This does not provide a complete picture of sleep patterns, but it indicates that rest and activity could overlap in ways that differ from modern expectations. In such a context, the absence of a bed aligns with the absence of a clearly defined sleeping period confined to a specific place. Rest was not anchored to a fixed surface or a fixed schedule. It occurred within a broader flow of activity and response. This connection between sleep and environmental rhythm also relates to the origin of human life in dynamic ecosystems, where survival depended on flexibility. The ability to rest when conditions allowed, rather than only under ideal circumstances, would support continued movement and adaptation. Over long periods, this flexibility would become part of the body's functional range. A fixed, protected sleeping surface would only become necessary when the surrounding conditions changed, when stability increased, when environments could be controlled, and when daily routines became more regular. Before that point, the variability of the environment remained the dominant influence. The absence of a bed, therefore, reflects a period in which sleep was not separated from the world outside but moved with it. When we consider the present, where a bed often marks the beginning of sleep and a controlled environment sustains it through the night, the difference becomes more pronounced. The modern structure of sleep is built on stability, repetition, and separation. In contrast, earlier sleep was built on responsiveness, variability, and integration. This difference does not suggest that one form is inherently better, but it highlights a shift in how humans relate to their surroundings during rest. For most of human history, the body did not require a stable surface or a protected space to enter sleep. It required conditions that were sufficient, even if they were not consistent. And within those conditions, sleep remained part of a larger system, shaped continuously by the environment rather than isolated from it. When sleep is not protected by walls, controlled light, or a fixed surface, the boundary between being awake and being asleep becomes less defined. In modern settings, this boundary is often marked by clear signals: a bed, a darkened room, a routine that leads the body toward rest. Once these conditions are met, the expectation is that sleep will begin and continue without interruption. But for most of human history, these signals were either absent or far less consistent. The body did not enter sleep as a separate state fully detached from its surroundings. Instead, it moved gradually along a spectrum where awareness and rest could overlap. This overlap suggests that early human sleep may not have been organized into a single continuous block. Rather, it may have included periods of lighter rest interspersed with moments of increased awareness shaped by changes in the environment. If we return to the conditions in which early humans lived, this pattern becomes more understandable. Without artificial light, the transition into darkness was gradual, and the duration of night varied depending on location and season. In longer nights, maintaining a single uninterrupted period of deep sleep may not have been necessary or even practical. The body could shift between phases of rest, responding to internal rhythms and external cues. Sounds in the environment, changes in temperature, or movement within a group could bring a person closer to wakefulness without fully ending the period of rest. This does not mean that sleep was constantly disturbed, but that it may have been more flexible in structure, adjusting to the conditions of the moment rather than following a fixed pattern. Anthropological observations of some contemporary groups living in less industrialized environments suggest that sleep can occur in segments, with periods of quiet wakefulness during the night. While these observations cannot be directly applied to all past populations, they offer a possible model for how sleep might function without strict environmental control. In such patterns, the distinction between being asleep and being awake is not always sharp. A person may rest quietly, with reduced activity, without fully entering deep sleep, and then return to deeper rest later. This fluidity reduces the dependence on a single, uninterrupted block of sleep and allows rest to adapt to varying conditions. From an evolutionary perspective, this flexibility may have provided an advantage. Maintaining some level of awareness during the night could increase responsiveness to potential threats or changes in the environment. This does not require full wakefulness, but rather a state in which the body is capable of transitioning between rest and alertness without significant delay. Over long periods, such a pattern would shape how the body regulates sleep, making it less dependent on a stable, protected setting. In contrast, a bed and a controlled environment support a different structure. They encourage the body to enter a more isolated state of rest, where external influences are minimized and continuity is maintained. This shift toward isolation and continuity is relatively recent when viewed across the full span of human history. Before that shift, the absence of a bed aligns with the absence of a sharply defined boundary between sleep and wakefulness. The body did not require complete separation from the environment to rest. It remained connected, adjusting its level of awareness as conditions changed. This connection also influences how we understand the role of comfort. In a modern context, comfort often means the reduction of all potential disturbances. In earlier conditions, comfort may have been defined more by the ability to maintain rest despite those disturbances. The body did not wait for complete stillness in the environment. It adapted to a setting where stillness was partial and temporary. This suggests that the function of sleep was not dependent on eliminating variability, but on managing it. When we consider the long period in which humans lived without beds, it becomes clear that rest was not organized around a fixed place or a fixed state. It was part of a continuous interaction between the body and its surroundings. The boundary between waking and sleeping remained flexible, shaped by environmental rhythms rather than controlled conditions. And within that flexibility, the absence of a bed was not a limitation, but a reflection of how sleep itself was structured in relation to the world outside. As the boundary between wakefulness and sleep remained flexible, the rhythm of the night did not belong to a single, uninterrupted phase of rest. Instead, it could unfold in cycles that followed both internal signals and external conditions. When the body is not enclosed within a controlled environment, it continues to register subtle changes even during rest. A slight drop in temperature before dawn, a shift in wind, or a sound carried across open space may not fully wake a person, but can move them closer to the surface of awareness. From there, the body may either return to deeper rest or remain in a quieter, semi-alert state for a period of time. This pattern suggests that rest could expand and contract throughout the night, rather than remaining fixed in a single continuous form. In such conditions, the idea of waking up in the middle of the night would not necessarily be experienced as a disruption. It could be part of a broader rhythm in which periods of stillness and awareness alternate naturally. Without artificial light or strict schedules, there would be little pressure to maintain a specific structure of sleep. The body could follow its own timing, guided by fatigue, environmental cues, and the needs of the group. If others nearby shifted position, tended a fire, or responded to a change in the surroundings, these small movements could influence the overall pattern of rest without fully interrupting it. Sleep, in this sense, was not isolated within the individual. It was part of a shared environment where multiple bodies responded to the same conditions. This shared responsiveness may have created a form of distributed awareness within a group. At any given moment, some individuals might be in deeper rest while others remained closer to wakefulness. There is no clear evidence that this pattern was organized in a deliberate way, but it reflects a possibility that rest did not occur uniformly across all members at the same time. Instead, it could shift gradually within the group, allowing for periods where awareness remained present even during the night. This would not require full wakefulness, but rather a range of states between sleep and alertness. Over long periods, such a pattern could influence how the body regulates transitions between these states. Rather than relying on a single defined moment of falling asleep and waking up, the body becomes accustomed to moving between levels of rest more fluidly. This fluidity reduces the need for a fixed environment to support sleep. A bed, in contrast, reinforces a different structure. It signals a clear beginning and end to the sleeping period, encouraging the body to enter a deeper, more continuous state of rest. It also separates the individual from the immediate environment, reducing the number of external cues that might prompt a shift in awareness. While this creates stability, it also narrows the range of conditions under which the body expects to sleep. In earlier contexts where such stability was not available, the body maintained a broader capacity to adapt. Archaeological evidence does not directly record sleep patterns, but it does show that early human sites often contain signs of repeated nighttime activity. The presence of maintained hearths, layers of ash, and changes in material distribution suggest that activity did not cease completely after dark. This supports the idea that the night was not a uniform period of inactivity, but a time in which rest and low-level activity could coexist. In such a setting, the absence of a bed aligns with the absence of a clearly defined, uninterrupted sleep period. Rest did not depend on a specific structure or location. It emerged within a continuous flow of environmental interaction. When we compare this to the modern expectation of sleeping through the night in a single unbroken period, the difference becomes more apparent. Today, waking during the night is often seen as a problem to be corrected. In earlier conditions, it may have been part of the normal rhythm of rest. The body was not required to remain in one state for a fixed duration. It could adjust as needed, moving between rest and awareness in response to both internal and external signals. This adaptability is central to understanding why a bed was not necessary for most of human history. A bed supports continuity and isolation, but when sleep itself is structured around variation and responsiveness, such support is not essential. The body does not require a stable surface to maintain rest. It requires conditions that allow it to move between states without interruption from its own environment. And in that context, the absence of a bed reflects a broader pattern in which sleep remained part of an ongoing interaction with the world, rather than a state separated from it. As this flexible rhythm of rest continued across long periods of human history, it would gradually shape what the body considered normal when entering sleep. Without a fixed boundary marking the beginning of sleep, the transition itself became less defined. The body did not wait for a specific signal, such as lying on a bed or entering a closed space. Instead, it responded to a combination of internal fatigue and external conditions that were never entirely stable. This meant that the process of falling asleep could begin before the body was fully still and continue even as small adjustments were still taking place. In such a setting, rest did not require a complete separation from movement or awareness. It could emerge within partial stillness, expanding as conditions allowed and contracting when they changed. This gradual process suggests that sleep was not a single event, but a shifting state that developed over time rather than beginning at a precise moment. If we consider how this pattern interacts with the absence of a bed, the connection becomes clearer. A bed provides a defined starting point. It marks a transition from activity to rest, creating a physical and psychological boundary that signals the body to change state. Without that boundary, the body relies more heavily on internal cues and environmental rhythms. Fatigue accumulates, light fades, temperature drops, and the body responds by reducing activity step by step. There is no single moment where sleep begins in a clear, isolated way. Instead, there is a gradual deepening of rest, influenced by conditions that remain active throughout the night. This gradual deepening may also explain why early human sleep did not require complete stillness. Small movements, changes in posture, or brief returns to awareness would not necessarily interrupt the overall process. They would be part of it. The body could move between levels of rest without losing the continuity of the experience. Over time, this ability to shift between states would become integrated into how sleep functions, allowing rest to persist even when conditions were not ideal. In contrast, a modern sleeping environment encourages a different pattern. The bed, combined with a controlled space, creates a setting where the body can remain in a stable position for longer periods, with fewer external influences prompting change. This stability supports deeper, more continuous sleep, but it also reduces the need for flexibility. The body becomes accustomed to a narrower range of conditions, expecting a consistent surface and a clear separation from the surrounding environment. When these conditions are not met, rest may feel more difficult, not necessarily because the body is incapable, but because its expectations have shifted. Archaeological and anthropological perspectives suggest that early human life involved frequent transitions between activity and rest, even within the same period of darkness. The presence of fire, the need to maintain awareness, and the variability of environmental conditions all contribute to a setting where sleep is interwoven with other behaviors. This interweaving reinforces the idea that rest was not confined to a single, uninterrupted block. It existed within a broader pattern of living, where the body remained connected to its surroundings at all times. The absence of a bed fits within this pattern. A fixed surface encourages separation and continuity. Without it, sleep remains distributed across time, shaped by the same forces that shape waking activity. When we step back and consider this from a wider perspective, the difference between past and present becomes more than a matter of comfort. It reflects a shift in how the human body organizes rest in relation to the world around it. For most of human history, sleep did not begin at a clear moment or occur in a clearly defined place. It developed gradually, adjusted continuously, and remained connected to the environment throughout the night. The body did not require a stable surface to support this process, because the process itself was built on change rather than consistency. And within that framework, the absence of a bed is not simply a missing object. It is part of a broader system in which rest and awareness exist along a continuum, shaped by conditions that are never entirely still. In a world without fixed sleeping surfaces, the idea of personal space during rest would also take on a different form. There was no individual bed marking a clear boundary between one body and another, no designated area that belonged exclusively to a single person night after night. Instead, space was shared, negotiated moment by moment, shaped by the immediate needs of the group and the conditions of the environment. When people lay down to rest, they did so in relation to one another, adjusting position based on proximity, warmth, and available ground. This suggests that sleep was not only an individual state, but also a collective arrangement, influenced by how bodies were distributed within a shared space. If we look back to earlier stages of human existence, especially in mobile groups that moved across landscapes, the importance of staying within close range of others becomes more apparent. Proximity could provide warmth in cooler conditions, reduce exposure to open space, and maintain a sense of connection within the group. Without constructed barriers or separate rooms, the distance between individuals would be limited by what the environment allowed. The ground itself did not divide space into personal zones. It extended continuously, and bodies occupied it together. This continuity meant that the boundary between my space and shared space remained fluid. A person might shift position during the night, and the surrounding arrangement would adjust in response. There is no clear evidence that early humans consistently organized sleeping positions according to strict patterns, but archaeological traces suggest that areas around hearths often became focal points where people gathered. The distribution of materials and signs of repeated use indicate that these spaces were shared rather than divided into individual sections. The fire, as a source of warmth and light, would naturally draw people closer together, reinforcing the idea that rest occurred within a collective setting. In such an arrangement, the absence of a bed aligns with the absence of clearly defined personal boundaries during sleep. The body did not rest in isolation but in proximity to others, within a space that remained open and shared. This shared environment would also influence how rest was maintained. Movements by one person could affect others nearby, creating a subtle interaction between bodies even during sleep. A shift in position, a change in posture, or a response to environmental conditions could ripple through the group, prompting small adjustments in others. These interactions do not necessarily disrupt rest, but they contribute to a form of collective responsiveness. Sleep, in this sense, becomes part of a dynamic system where multiple bodies adjust together rather than independently. Over long periods, such patterns could shape how the body perceives safety and stability during rest. The presence of others may provide a form of reassurance, allowing the body to relax within a shared space rather than relying on physical barriers for protection. In contrast, modern sleeping environments often emphasize separation. A bed defines a personal area, and walls or rooms create boundaries that isolate individuals from one another. This structure supports privacy and reduces external disturbance, but it also changes the social context of sleep. The body becomes accustomed to resting alone, within a controlled space that limits interaction. This shift toward individualization is closely tied to the development of stable living environments, where space can be divided and maintained over time. Before such stability existed, the conditions did not support the creation of permanent personal sleeping areas. The absence of a bed, therefore, reflects not only a lack of constructed surfaces, but also a different organization of social space. Rest occurred within a shared environment, where boundaries were flexible and positions could change from night to night. When we consider this in relation to the broader question, it becomes clear that a bed is more than a physical object. It represents a division of space, a way of separating one body from another and from the surrounding environment. But in earlier conditions, where movement, exposure, and shared space defined daily life, that division was not yet established. Sleep remained part of a collective experience, shaped by proximity and interaction rather than by separation. And within that experience, the ground served as a common surface, connecting bodies to each other as much as to the environment itself. When space is shared without fixed boundaries, the position of each body becomes part of a constantly adjusting arrangement rather than a predefined layout. There is no assigned place that remains the same each night, no permanent claim over a specific section of ground. Instead, the arrangement forms gradually as people settle down, influenced by immediate factors such as the location of a fire, the direction of the wind, or the shape of the terrain. One person may lie closer to a warmer area, another may choose a slightly elevated spot to avoid damp ground, and others may position themselves in between. These choices are not fixed decisions carried from one night to the next. They are responses to conditions that change, sometimes subtly, sometimes more noticeably. As a result, the configuration of the group during rest remains fluid, shifting over time rather than repeating in a stable pattern. This fluidity also affects how the body experiences rest in relation to others. Without a bed to define individual space, proximity is negotiated through small adjustments rather than rigid boundaries. A person might move slightly to create more room, or draw closer to share warmth. These movements are often minimal, but they reflect an ongoing process of coordination within the group. There is no clear line that marks where one person's sleeping space ends and another's begins. Instead, there is a shared surface where positions overlap and adapt. Over long periods, this pattern could shape a sense of spatial awareness that remains active even during rest. The body does not become entirely isolated. It remains aware, at some level, of the presence and movement of others nearby. Archaeological evidence, while indirect, supports the idea that early human groups occupied space in ways that were flexible rather than fixed. The distribution of tools, remnants of food, and traces of fire activity suggest areas of repeated use, but they do not show clear divisions into individual zones. The ground itself does not preserve boundaries, and the materials available would not easily support the construction of separate sleeping platforms for each individual. Even when simple bedding materials such as plant matter or animal skins may have been used, they would not necessarily create a lasting separation. They could be moved, shared, or abandoned as conditions changed. This reinforces the idea that personal sleeping space was not defined by a permanent structure, but by temporary positioning within a shared environment. In contrast, the introduction of beds marks a shift towards stability and ownership of space. A bed remains in place, often associated with a specific individual and used in a consistent way over time. It creates a defined area that does not change with each use, reinforcing a clear boundary between one person and another. This boundary extends beyond the physical surface. It shapes expectations about privacy, distance, and personal comfort during rest. The body becomes accustomed to having a fixed area that does not require negotiation or adjustment each night. Before this shift, the absence of such a structure meant that rest was more closely tied to the immediate social and environmental context. Positions were determined by conditions, not by predefined arrangements. The body adapted not only to the ground beneath it, but also to the presence of others sharing that same ground. This dual adaptation to surface and to social space suggests that sleep was integrated into a broader pattern of interaction. It was not a solitary act separated from others, but a collective state that unfolded within a shared setting. When we consider how this relates to the absence of beds, it becomes clear that a bed does more than provide support for the body. It establishes a stable, individual space within a larger environment. Without the conditions that support stability, permanent settlements, consistent materials, and defined ownership, such a structure does not easily emerge. Instead, rest remains flexible, shaped by changing arrangements that reflect both environmental factors and group dynamics. For most of human history, this flexibility was not a limitation. It was part of how life was organized, allowing the body to rest within a space that was never entirely fixed, but always responsive to the conditions of the moment. Over extended periods of time, this shared and flexible use of space would shape not only how people positioned themselves during rest, but also how the body interpreted the presence of others as part of its sleeping environment. When there is no fixed boundary separating one individual from another, the body does not rely on physical distance to establish a sense of security. Instead, it becomes accustomed to proximity as a normal condition. The warmth of nearby bodies, the subtle sounds of breathing or movement, and the shifting distribution of weight across the ground all become part of the background within which rest occurs. These elements are not interruptions. They are integrated into the experience of sleep itself. This integration suggests that the body does not require isolation to rest effectively. It can settle into a state of reduced activity even while remaining in close contact with others, adjusting continuously to small changes without fully disengaging from its surroundings. If we trace this pattern back to earlier stages of human development, when survival depended on maintaining awareness of both environmental and social conditions, the presence of others during rest may have carried functional importance. Proximity could reduce exposure to open space, increase shared warmth, and create a distributed pattern of responsiveness within the group. While there is no direct evidence that early humans organized sleep in a deliberate system of shared vigilance, the conditions suggest that complete isolation would not have been the norm. Instead, rest likely occurred within a network of nearby bodies, each responding to the same environment in slightly different ways. This network does not require constant wakefulness, but it does allow for a range of states between deep sleep and lighter awareness to coexist within the group. Over long periods, such conditions could influence how the body associates safety with its surroundings. Rather than depending on physical barriers, such as walls or elevated surfaces, the body may rely more on the continuity of the group and the predictability of shared presence. In contrast, modern sleeping environments often replace this social continuity with structural separation. A bed defines an individual space, and walls or rooms create layers of distance between people. This arrangement supports privacy and reduces direct interaction during rest, but it also changes the context in which the body experiences sleep. The signals of safety become tied to the stability of the environment rather than the presence of others. The body learns to expect a consistent surface, a defined boundary, and a controlled space. When these conditions are present, rest can deepen without the need for ongoing adjustment to nearby movement. Archaeological findings do not preserve direct evidence of how individuals experience proximity during sleep, but they do show patterns of repeated shared use of space. Hearth-centered areas, clusters of activity, and overlapping traces of occupation suggest that people remained close to one another, especially in settings where resources and protection were concentrated. These patterns reinforce the idea that rest was not organized around isolated units, but around shared environments where multiple individuals occupied the same ground. Even when simple materials were used to create a layer between the body and the surface, these materials did not establish permanent boundaries. They remained part of a flexible arrangement that could change from one night to the next. When we consider how this relates to the absence of beds, it becomes clear that a bed is not only a surface for the body, but also a marker of separation within space. It defines where one person rests and where another does not, creating a stable boundary that persists over time. Without the conditions that support such boundaries, including stable settlements and the ability to maintain fixed structures, the concept of an individual sleeping space does not fully develop. Instead, rest remains embedded within a shared context, where positions are negotiated rather than assigned, and where proximity is a constant rather than an exception. This shared context is central to understanding why beds did not appear earlier. The need for a fixed individual surface arises alongside changes in how space is organized and how people relate to one another during rest. For most of human history, those conditions had not yet emerged. The body adapted to a form of rest that was collective, flexible, and continuously responsive to both the environment and the presence of others. And within that form, the absence of a bed reflects not a lack, but a different way of organizing rest in relation to space and to other bodies. When we look for evidence of how early humans rested, we do not find preserved beds or clearly defined sleeping structures. Instead, what remains in the archaeological record are indirect traces, subtle changes in the ground, layers of material, and patterns of repeated use that suggest where people once paused, gathered, and likely lay down. These traces do not present a clear image of a sleeping place in the modern sense. They require careful interpretation, because the act of rest leaves behind very little that can be easily identified after long periods of time. Yet within these faint signals, there are indications of how space was used, and how the absence of a fixed surface shaped the conditions of sleep. One of the most consistent features found in early human sites is the presence of hearths. Areas where fire was maintained often show layers of ash, charcoal, and heat-altered soil. Around these zones, the ground may appear more compacted, suggesting repeated occupation. While these areas were not exclusively used for sleep, they likely served as focal points where people spent extended periods, including moments of rest. The warmth of the fire, even as it faded through the night, would create a gradient of temperature, influencing where bodies settled in relation to it. However, this arrangement does not form a structured sleeping area. The ground remains uneven, altered by ash and movement, and changes each time the fire is used. There is no indication of a stable, constructed surface that persists across repeated use. In some locations, there is evidence that plant materials such as grasses or leaves may have been gathered and placed on the ground. These materials could provide a slight layer of insulation or reduce direct contact with the soil. Yet these layers are not preserved in a way that suggests permanence. Organic materials decompose, shift, and are easily dispersed by wind, water, or continued activity. What remains are only faint impressions or traces of their presence, often difficult to distinguish from the surrounding environment. This suggests that even when efforts were made to modify the surface, those modifications were temporary. They did not create a lasting separation between the body and the ground, but rather a brief adjustment within an already variable setting. Beyond hearths and possible plant layers, the broader spatial patterns of archaeological sites also provide insight. In many cases, there is no clear division between areas used for different activities. Tools, food remains, and other artifacts are often distributed in ways that suggest overlapping use of space. This overlap indicates that the same areas could serve multiple purposes at different times, including rest. The absence of dedicated, enclosed sleeping zones reinforces the idea that sleep was not isolated as a separate activity requiring its own structure. It occurred within the same spaces where other aspects of life unfolded, shaped by immediate conditions rather than by long-term design. When we consider how these traces relate to the question of beds, an important point emerges. The development of a bed requires not only materials and techniques, but also the ability to maintain a structure over time. It depends on stability, on returning to the same place and preserving a surface in a consistent form. The archaeological record from earlier periods does not show this kind of stability. Instead, it shows repeated use without permanent transformation. The ground is used, altered slightly, and then left to change again. Each return to a site does not recreate the exact same conditions, but builds upon a surface that has already shifted. This pattern suggests that the concept of a fixed sleeping surface had not yet taken hold. The body adapted to the ground as it was found, rather than shaping it into a consistent form. In this way, the absence of beds in the archaeological record is not simply due to the loss of materials over time. It reflects a deeper pattern in how space was used and how rest was integrated into daily life. Sleep did not leave behind clear structures because it did not rely on them. It occurred within environments that were only lightly modified, where the ground remained the primary surface and where stability was limited. These traces, though subtle, point toward a form of rest that was flexible and responsive, shaped by conditions that could not be fully controlled. And within that flexibility, the absence of a bed becomes part of a broader picture, one in which the human body rested without the need for a fixed, enduring surface. Even in sites where evidence appears more concentrated, the traces of rest remain indirect and open to interpretation. Layers of compacted soil, slight depressions in the ground, and accumulations of organic residue can suggest repeated human presence, yet they do not form a clear outline of a constructed sleeping surface. These features indicate that bodies return to similar areas over time, but they also show that the ground itself was never transformed into a fixed, enduring platform. Each use would subtly alter the surface, compressing it in some places, loosening it in others, while natural processes such as rain, wind, and the growth or decay of plant matter would continue to reshape it between visits. What emerges from these patterns is not a stable structure, but a surface that carries the memory of repeated contact without becoming permanent. This distinction is important because it highlights how rest could occur in familiar locations without relying on a consistent physical form. If we look more closely at how these areas change over time, a gradual layering becomes visible. Ash from fires spreads outward and mixes with soil, organic fragments accumulate and break down, and repeated foot traffic alters the texture of the ground. These layers do not remain static. They shift, merge, and sometimes disappear entirely as new material is added or removed. In such a setting, even if a group returned to the same place across seasons, the exact conditions of the ground would not be identical. The body, therefore, would not encounter a surface that could be recognized as unchanged. Instead, it would encounter variation within familiarity, a space that is known but not fixed. This reinforces the idea that rest did not depend on reproducing the same physical conditions each night. It depended on the ability to adapt to surfaces that were similar enough to be usable, but different enough to require adjustment. There are also cases where the spatial organization of a site suggests repeated clustering around certain features, such as a central fire or a sheltered area. Within these clusters, The distribution of materials can hint at zones of activity, but these zones remain fluid. There is no sharp boundary that separates where one function ends and another begins. The same area might be used for preparing food, maintaining tools, and eventually lying down to rest. This overlap suggests that the concept of dedicating a specific structure solely to sleep had not yet emerged. Instead, rest was embedded within a multi-purpose space, shaped by immediate needs rather than long-term design. The absence of clearly defined sleeping structures in these contexts does not imply a lack of organization, but rather a different form of organization, one that remains flexible and responsive to changing conditions. From a broader perspective, this pattern aligns with the idea that early human life was characterized by movement and adaptation rather than permanence. Even in locations that show signs of repeated occupation, the level of modification remains limited. Surfaces are used, not fundamentally restructured. Materials are gathered and applied temporarily, not fixed into place. This suggests that the effort required to create a stable, elevated sleeping surface would not have been sustained over time, especially when the environment itself continued to change. The development of such a surface depends on a different relationship with space, one in which the ground is no longer accepted as it is, but is reshaped into something consistent and enduring. That relationship appears later, alongside more stable patterns of settlement and resource use. When we consider how this relates to the absence of beds, it becomes clear that the archaeological record is not simply missing evidence of constructed sleeping surfaces. It is showing a pattern in which those surfaces were not central to how rest was organized. The traces that remain point toward a form of rest that relied on repeated use of space without transforming it into a fixed structure. The ground carried the imprint of human presence, but it did not become a permanent platform. Each layer tells a story of temporary adaptation rather than lasting construction. And within that story, the absence of a bed reflects a broader way of living where stability was limited and the body adapted to surfaces that were always in the process of changing. When these layers of use and change are considered together, a consistent pattern begins to appear. The archaeological record does not present evidence of surfaces built to remain the same over time, but rather surfaces that were repeatedly used and then altered again by both human activity and natural processes. This pattern suggests that the ground was not treated as something to be permanently reshaped into a stable platform. Instead, it remained part of a dynamic environment, one that could be adjusted temporarily but not fixed in a lasting way. Even in places where people returned multiple times, the surface did not preserve a single continuous form. It carried traces of past use, but each new period of occupation introduced further change. This ongoing transformation meant that rest could not rely on a consistent physical structure. The body encountered variation even within familiar locations, reinforcing the need to adapt rather than to depend on stability. In some archaeological contexts, there are indications that surfaces were prepared to a limited extent. Ground may have been cleared of debris, smoothed in small areas, or layered with available materials. These actions suggest an awareness of how the surface could be modified to improve conditions for rest. However, these modifications remain minimal and temporary. They do not create a defined object that persists across time. A cleared patch of ground can quickly accumulate new material. A layer of plant matter can shift, decay, or be removed. What remains is not a constructed bed, but a momentary adjustment within a surface that continues to change. This distinction is central to understanding why beds did not appear earlier. The effort to create a permanent, raised surface requires not only materials and tools, but also a context in which that effort can be maintained. Without stability in location and resources, such a structure would not remain useful for long. The archaeological record reflects this limitation. It shows repeated adaptation to the ground as it is found, rather than transformation of the ground into something fixed. Another important aspect is the scale of modification. In later periods, when more permanent settlements begin to appear, we start to see clearer signs of structured spaces, defined floors, built platforms, and eventually furniture designed for specific purposes. In earlier periods, these features are largely absent. The scale of change remains small, localized, and temporary. This suggests that the concept of dedicating effort to create a stable surface for rest had not yet become necessary or practical. The ground, despite its variability, remained sufficient. The body could rest on it without requiring a consistent form, and the environment did not yet support the maintenance of such a form over time. When we connect these observations to the broader question, a clearer picture emerges. The absence of beds in early human history is not simply due to the loss of fragile materials or the limitations of preservation. It reflects a deeper pattern in which rest was organized around flexibility rather than permanence. The surfaces used for sleep were part of the same environment that supported all other activities, and they changed continuously. The body adapted to these changes, maintaining the ability to rest across a wide range of conditions. Only when human life began to stabilize, when people remained in one place long enough to reshape their surroundings in lasting ways, did the possibility of a fixed sleeping surface begin to emerge. Before that shift, the archaeological record shows a world in which surfaces were used but not fixed, modified but not stabilized. Within that world, the absence of a bed is not an anomaly. It is a reflection of how space was understood and used. Rest did not require a permanent structure, because the conditions of life did not support one. Instead, sleep remained part of an environment that was always in motion, and the body learned to rest within that motion without needing to transform it into something still. At a certain point in human history, small changes begin to appear in how the ground is used for rest. These changes do not immediately lead to what we would recognize as a bed, but they mark a gradual shift in how the body relates to the surface beneath it. Instead of accepting the ground entirely as it is found, there are signs that it is being adjusted with more intention. Natural materials, branches, leaves, grasses, and animal skins may be gathered and arranged in ways that slightly alter the immediate contact between the body and the earth. These adjustments remain simple and temporary, yet they introduce an important idea. The surface of rest can be modified, even if only for a short time. This idea does not emerge suddenly or uniformly across all regions. It appears in different forms, influenced by available materials and environmental conditions. In forested areas, soft plant matter could be collected and layered to create a more insulated surface. In colder regions, animal skins might provide a barrier that reduces direct heat loss to the ground. These materials do not create a stable structure, but they begin to change the experience of rest in subtle ways. The body is still connected to the ground, but that connection is now filtered through an added layer that can be arranged and replaced. This marks a transition from pure adaptation toward partial modification, where the environment is no longer accepted entirely as it is, but is adjusted to meet immediate needs. Archaeological findings offer some support for this shift, although the evidence remains indirect. In certain sites, traces of plant residues and patterns of wear suggest that organic materials may have been used repeatedly in specific areas. These materials are rarely preserved in a complete form, but their presence can sometimes be inferred from impressions or from chemical signatures left in the soil. Such evidence does not point to permanent bedding structures, but it does indicate that the surface was being altered in a more deliberate way. The ground is no longer simply used, it is prepared, even if that preparation does not last beyond a short period. This preparation introduces a new relationship between the body and its resting surface. The body still adapts, but it now interacts with a surface that has been partially shaped to reduce certain discomforts. Over time, this practice could influence how rest is experienced. A layer of plant material can distribute pressure more evenly, reduce direct contact with moisture, and provide a slight buffer against temperature changes. These effects are modest, but they represent a step toward creating a more controlled resting condition. The body begins to encounter surfaces that are not entirely natural, but not yet fully constructed either. This intermediate state is important because it shows that the development of beds was not an abrupt invention, but a gradual process of increasing control over the surface of rest. However, even with these modifications, the surface remains unstable. The materials used are loose, easily displaced, and subject to decay. A layer of leaves may shift during the night, compress under weight, or be scattered by movement. Animal skins, if used, must be carried, maintained, and protected from damage. These limitations prevent the surface from becoming a fixed structure. Each time a group moves or returns to a location, the process of preparation must be repeated. There is no lasting platform that remains unchanged. This repetition reinforces the idea that rest is still tied to immediate conditions rather than to a permanent arrangement. When we consider why beds did not appear earlier, This stage of partial modification offers an important insight. The ability to alter the surface existed, but the conditions required to maintain a stable, elevated structure did not. Without long-term settlement, without consistent access to durable materials, and without a need for permanent structures, these early adjustments remained temporary. The ground was still the primary surface, and the body continued to adapt to its variability. What changed was not the existence of the ground, but the way it was approached, no longer entirely accepted, but not yet fully transformed. This gradual shift sets the stage for later developments, where the idea of a prepared surface evolves into something more stable. But at this point in the timeline, the changes remain subtle. The body is still close to the earth, still influenced by its variations, and still capable of resting without a fixed structure. The absence of a bed persists, not because the idea of modifying the surface is unknown, but because the conditions needed to turn that idea into a lasting form have not yet come together. As these small adjustments became more familiar, the act of preparing a place to rest could begin to take on a repeated form, even if it did not yet produce a stable structure. Gathering materials, clearing a patch of ground, and arranging a layer between the body and the soil might occur more consistently within certain groups or environments. This repetition does not create a permanent bed, but it introduces a pattern. Before resting, the surface is briefly shaped. The ground is no longer entirely accepted as it is found, and yet it is not transformed into something lasting. It exists in an intermediate state, where preparation becomes part of the routine without becoming a fixed construction. This pattern reflects a subtle shift in how time is used. Preparing a surface requires attention and effort, even if minimal, and that effort must be repeated each time conditions change or a group moves. The investment remains short-term, aligned with a way of living that does not yet support permanence. The materials used in this preparation also reveal the limits of what can be sustained. Plant matter can be gathered quickly, but it compresses and loses structure under repeated use. Animal skins, if available, provide more durability, yet they require maintenance and may not always be accessible in sufficient quantity. Neither of these materials creates a surface that can remain unchanged over long periods without continued effort. This limitation reinforces the idea that rest is still tied to immediate conditions rather than to a stable, repeatable form. The body encounters a surface that has been slightly modified, but still retains much of the variability of the ground beneath it. Each night, the arrangement may differ slightly, depending on what materials are available and how they are placed. Over time, this repeated but temporary preparation could influence how the body anticipates rest. The presence of a softer or more insulated layer may reduce certain forms of discomfort, making it easier to settle more quickly. Yet because the surface is not consistent, the body does not become dependent on a specific arrangement. It remains adaptable, capable of adjusting to variations within the prepared layer itself. The expectation that rest requires a particular type of support has not yet formed. Instead, the body responds to a range of conditions, some slightly improved by preparation, others left unchanged. This balance between modification and adaptation is important when considering the transition toward more structured sleeping surfaces. The idea that the ground can be altered introduces the possibility of further change, but the absence of permanence limits how far that change can extend. Without a stable location, any improvement must be recreated repeatedly. This repetition does not accumulate into a fixed structure. It remains a series of individual actions, each one temporary. The ground returns to its original variability once the materials are removed, scattered, or decomposed. In this way, the process of preparation does not yet lead to the development of a bed, because the conditions required to sustain a consistent surface are still missing. Archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, aligns with this interpretation. In some sites, patterns of plant residue or compacted areas suggest repeated preparation, yet these patterns do not form a continuous, stable layer across time. They appear and disappear within the sequence of occupation, reflecting moments of use rather than a lasting transformation. This reinforces the idea that the surface of rest remained flexible, shaped by short-term actions rather than long-term construction. The absence of a bed, therefore, is not due to a lack of awareness that the ground could be modified. It is due to the absence of conditions that would allow such modifications to become permanent. When we view this stage within the broader timeline, it becomes clear that the transition from ground to bed is not defined by a single invention, but by a gradual increase in stability. As long as life remains mobile and materials remain temporary, the surface of rest cannot become fixed. The body continues to adapt, even as small improvements are introduced. The ground is no longer entirely untouched, but it is not yet transformed into a stable platform. And within this intermediate state, the absence of a bed reflects a balance between what can be changed and what must still be accepted as it is. As this repeated preparation of the ground continued across different environments and generations, it gradually introduced a new expectation, even if that expectation remained limited. The body began to encounter surfaces that were not entirely raw, but also not fully controlled. Each time materials were gathered and arranged, however briefly, a small layer of intention was added between the body and the earth. This layer did not remove the variability of the ground, but it reduced some of its immediate effects. Over time, such repeated experiences could begin to influence how rest was anticipated. The body might come to expect a slight degree of separation, even if that separation could not always be achieved. Yet this expectation remained flexible, because the conditions that supported it were never guaranteed. In many cases, materials might not be available, or the environment might not allow for preparation. In those moments, the body would return to resting directly on the ground without difficulty, maintaining its ability to adapt. This balance between expectation and adaptability is central to understanding this stage of development. The idea of modifying the surface existed, but it had not yet replaced the body's capacity to adjust to natural conditions. If we consider how this process relates to the broader history of human life, it becomes clear that it represents a transition, not a conclusion. The surface of rest is beginning to change, but it has not yet become an object that exists independently of the environment. A bed, as it is understood today, is a stable structure that remains in place, maintaining its form over time. At this stage, nothing of that kind exists. The surface must be recreated each time, using materials that do not persist. This repeated recreation prevents the development of a fixed relationship between the body and a specific form of support. The body does not return to the same surface night after night. It returns to a process, one that produces similar but not identical results. This distinction is subtle but important. A process can vary, while an object remains constant. At this point in human history, rest is still tied to the process rather than to the object. Archaeological traces reflect this difference. Evidence of plant use, compacted ground, and repeated occupation suggests that preparation occurred, but it does not reveal the presence of enduring structures. The materials involved do not accumulate into a permanent layer. They are added, used, and then dispersed. This cycle leaves behind only faint signals, indicating that the surface was altered temporarily rather than transformed in a lasting way. Even in locations where groups returned frequently, the absence of a continuous, stable platform suggests that the idea of fixing the surface into a consistent form had not yet taken hold. Instead, the ground remained something to be worked with, not something to be replaced. When we compare this to later developments, where raised platforms and constructed beds begin to appear, the difference becomes more pronounced. Those later structures require a different set of conditions: stable settlements, access to durable materials, and the ability to maintain a structure over time. Without these conditions, the transition from temporary preparation to permanent construction cannot occur. The body remains in a state of adaptation, supported by small adjustments rather than by a fixed surface. This helps explain why beds did not emerge earlier, even though the idea of modifying the ground was already present. The necessary conditions for permanence had not yet been established. The environment remained variable, movement remained common, and materials remained temporary. In such a context, the most effective strategy was not to build a stable structure, but to remain flexible. The body continued to adapt to the ground, even as small improvements were introduced. Rest remained a balance between what could be shaped and what had to be accepted. And within that balance, the absence of a bed reflects a stage in which human life had begun to influence the surface of rest, but had not yet reached the point where that surface could become fixed, elevated, and separate from the ground itself. At a later stage in human history, a more noticeable change begins to take shape, not only in how the surface is prepared, but in how the body is positioned in relation to the ground itself. Instead of only adding layers between the body and the earth, there are early signs of lifting the body slightly above the surface. This change does not happen everywhere at once, and it does not immediately produce a fully formed bed. It begins in small, uneven steps, influenced by the availability of materials and the growing stability of certain living environments. Branches, wooden frames, or compacted layers of material may be arranged in ways that create a slight elevation, even if that elevation is minimal and temporary. The body is still close to the ground, but no longer in direct contact with it in the same way as before. This marks a significant shift, because it introduces the idea that rest can occur on something separate from the earth, rather than directly within it. This separation, even in its earliest forms, begins to change how the body experiences its surroundings during rest. When the body is lifted, even slightly, the direct exchange of temperature with the ground is reduced. Moisture from the soil has less immediate impact, and small movements on the surface below are less likely to transfer directly through the body. These changes are not complete, but they introduce a different relationship between the body and the environment. The ground is no longer the primary interface. It becomes something beneath the surface of rest, rather than the surface itself. This distinction may appear subtle, but it represents a shift from adaptation toward control. The body is no longer responding entirely to the variability of the ground. Instead, the surface is being shaped in a way that reduces that variability. Archaeological evidence from later prehistoric and early settled contexts begins to show clearer indications of this shift. In some sites, there are signs of constructed features within living spaces, raised platforms, compacted floors, or areas that appear to have been deliberately built up over time. These features do not always serve only as sleeping areas, but they indicate a growing ability to modify the environment in a more lasting way. The materials used may still be simple, but their arrangement shows an intention to create a surface that persists beyond a single use. This persistence is key because it allows the body to return to a similar condition of rest across multiple nights. The surface does not need to be recreated each time. It remains, carrying forward its shape and position. This development is closely tied to changes in how people occupy space. As groups begin to remain in one place for longer periods, the effort invested in shaping the environment can accumulate. Structures can be maintained, repaired, and reused. Within this context, creating a raised surface becomes more practical, because it does not need to be abandoned or rebuilt repeatedly. The ground, once accepted as the primary surface of rest, begins to be replaced by constructed alternatives that offer greater stability. This transition does not happen suddenly, and it does not eliminate all variability, but it introduces a new direction. Rest is no longer entirely dependent on the conditions of the natural surface. It begins to depend on surfaces that are intentionally shaped and maintained. When we consider how this relates to the broader question, the emergence of raised surfaces represents more than a technical change. It reflects a shift in how humans relate to their environment during rest. The body is gradually separated from the ground, not completely, but enough to alter the experience of sleep. The variability of the natural surface is reduced, and the expectation of stability begins to form. This expectation, once established, can influence how rest is perceived and organized. A consistent surface allows for more predictable conditions, and over time, this predictability becomes part of what the body associates with rest. Before this shift, the body adapted to whatever surface was available. After it, the surface begins to adapt to the body in a more consistent way. Yet even at this stage, the transformation is incomplete. The structures are simple, the materials are limited, and the separation from the ground is partial. The absence of a bed, in the full modern sense, still persists. What we see instead is the beginning of a transition, where the ground is no longer the only option, and where the idea of lifting the body away from it starts to take form. As these raised surfaces became more common in certain settings, they began to do more than simply lift the body away from the ground. They started to organize space in a new way. A surface that remains in place across multiple nights creates a point of reference, something that can be returned to and recognized as the same. This introduces a different relationship between the body and its environment, where rest is no longer shaped entirely by immediate conditions, but also by the continuity of a constructed surface. The body begins to associate a particular location and form with the act of sleeping, even if that association is still developing. This change does not happen uniformly, and it depends on the increasing stability of human living patterns. As groups spend longer periods in one place, the effort invested in shaping and maintaining these surfaces becomes more practical, and the surface itself begins to hold its form across time. With this continuity, the experience of rest starts to shift. A raised platform does not change as quickly as the ground beneath it. It retains its shape, its height, and its basic structure from one use to the next. This stability reduces the need for constant adjustment. The body no longer needs to respond to small variations in the terrain each night because those variations are partially removed. Instead, the body encounters a surface that behaves in a predictable way. Over time, this predictability can influence how rest is initiated and maintained. The body begins to expect a certain level of consistency, and this expectation becomes part of the process of settling into sleep. What was once a flexible adaptation to variable conditions gradually becomes a reliance on a more stable environment. This shift also affects how space is divided. A raised surface often occupies a specific area within a living space, distinguishing it from the surrounding ground. Even if it is not yet assigned to a single individual, it introduces a form of separation. The surface itself becomes a defined zone, different from the rest of the environment. This distinction can influence how people move within the space, where they choose to sit, work, or rest. Over time, these distinctions may become more pronounced, leading to clearer boundaries between different functions of space. The act of sleeping begins to be associated with a particular place, rather than with a general area that changes from night to night. Archaeological evidence from later periods supports this development. In some early settlements, there are indications of built features that remain consistent across layers of occupation. Raised areas, compacted floors, and structured platforms suggest that the environment is being shaped with greater permanence. These features do not always serve exclusively as beds, but they show that the capacity to create stable surfaces is increasing. The materials used may still be simple, but their arrangement reflects a shift toward durability. The surface is no longer recreated each time. It is maintained, repaired, and reused, allowing it to persist as part of the living space. When we connect this to the broader question, the emergence of these surfaces marks a turning point. The absence of a bed is no longer due solely to the lack of materials or techniques. It becomes a matter of how space is organized and how long a structure can be maintained. As stability increases, the conditions that support the creation of a bed begin to come into place. The ground is no longer the only option, and the body begins to rely more on surfaces that remain consistent. Yet even at this stage, the transformation is not complete. The surfaces are still relatively simple, and the separation from the ground, while present, is not absolute. The body is still influenced by the surrounding environment, even as some of that influence is reduced. This intermediate stage highlights the gradual nature of the transition. The idea of a bed is forming, but it has not yet reached the level of complexity or stability seen in later periods. What is changing is not only the surface itself, but the relationship between the body, the environment, and the concept of rest. The body begins to expect consistency, the environment begins to provide it, and the surface becomes a bridge between the two. As this growing stability continues, the surface used for rest begins to shift from being a temporary arrangement to something that carries a sense of permanence. It is no longer rebuilt each night from whatever materials are available, but maintained over time as part of a space that itself remains in place. This persistence allows the body to encounter the same surface repeatedly, reinforcing a new kind of expectation. Rest is no longer only a response to fatigue within changing conditions. It becomes something that is anticipated in relation to a specific place and a consistent form. The body begins to recognize this form, even if only gradually, and to associate it with the act of lying down and becoming still. This recognition marks an important turning point because it changes how rest is initiated. Instead of adapting to each new surface, the body begins to rely on the continuity of a familiar one. This shift also alters how the environment is experienced during rest. When the surface remains stable, it reduces the need for continuous adjustment. The body can remain in a more consistent position for longer periods, and the small variations that once required constant response are partially removed. The ground, with all its irregularities, becomes something beneath the surface rather than the surface itself. This separation does not eliminate environmental influence entirely, but it changes its intensity. Temperature, moisture, and movement are filtered through the constructed layer, creating a more controlled interaction between the body and its surroundings. Over time, this controlled interaction may shape how the body perceives comfort. What was once acceptable as part of natural variation may begin to feel less tolerable when compared to the stability of a constructed surface. In this way, the body's expectations begin to shift alongside the environment. Archaeological evidence from more established settlements shows clearer signs of this transition. Surfaces that remain consistent across multiple layers of occupation suggest that they were not only built, but maintained and valued as part of daily life. In some cases, raised platforms or defined sleeping areas can be inferred from the arrangement of materials and the preservation of structural features. These do not always resemble modern beds, but they indicate a movement toward fixed surfaces that serve a specific function. The ground is no longer the primary interface for rest. It is replaced, at least in part, by structures that create distance and consistency. This development is closely linked to changes in how people organize their living spaces. As settlements become more stable, the division of space into different functions becomes more pronounced. Areas for cooking, working, and resting begin to separate, and within this separation, the surface used for sleep takes on a more defined role. It is no longer just a convenient spot within a shared environment. It becomes a designated place, maintained over time, and recognized as part of a structured living space. This designation reinforces the idea that rest belongs to a particular location rather than occurring wherever conditions allow. When we consider the broader implications of this shift, it becomes clear that the emergence of stable, raised surfaces represents more than a technical improvement. It reflects a change in how humans relate to both their environment and their own bodies during rest. The body begins to rely on consistency, and the environment begins to provide it in a sustained way. The absence of a bed, which once reflected a world of movement and variability, starts to give way to a new pattern in which stability becomes possible. Yet even here, the transformation is gradual. The structures remain simple, the materials are still limited, and the full separation from the ground is not complete. The modern concept of a bed has not yet fully formed. What exists instead is a stage in which the conditions for that concept are finally coming together. The ground is no longer the only option. The surface of rest is becoming stable, and the body is beginning to adapt to this new relationship. Within this convergence, but because the conditions which once made it unnecessary are slowly being replaced by conditions that make it possible, in the present, the surface on which the body rests has become one of the most controlled aspects of daily life. A bed is no longer a temporary arrangement or a simple raised platform. It is a constructed system, designed to remain stable, predictable, and separate from the environment. The materials used are chosen to maintain shape over time, to distribute weight evenly, and to reduce direct contact with external conditions. This system does not exist on its own. It is part of a larger environment in which temperature can be regulated, light can be controlled, and external disturbances can be minimized. Together, these elements create a setting where rest is expected to occur under consistent conditions, largely unchanged from one night to the next. This level of stability represents a significant departure from the conditions that shaped most of human history. If we trace this shift back to its origins, the contrast becomes more apparent. The body, which once adapted to a wide range of surfaces and environmental changes, now encounters a narrow set of repeated conditions. The surface does not vary from night to night, and the surrounding environment is often maintained within a limited range of temperature and light. This consistency reduces the need for the body to adjust continuously during rest. Movements become less frequent, positions remain more stable, and the experience of sleep becomes more uniform. Over time, this uniformity can influence what the body comes to expect. A surface that is too firm, too uneven, or too exposed may now feel unfamiliar, not necessarily because the body cannot adapt, but because it has become accustomed to a different baseline. This change in expectation is gradual, shaped by repetition rather than by a single moment of transition. Archaeological and historical evidence from more recent periods shows the increasing complexity of sleeping surfaces. What begins as simple raised platforms evolves into structures with added layers designed to enhance comfort and durability. Materials become more specialized, and the surface itself becomes an object that is maintained over long periods. This development reflects a broader change in how space is organized. The area used for sleep becomes distinct from other areas of activity, often enclosed and protected. Within this space, the bed serves as a central element, defining where and how rest occurs. The body, in turn, begins to associate this specific environment with the act of sleeping, reinforcing the connection between rest and a fixed location. From a biological perspective, this shift introduces a new relationship between the body and its surroundings. The variability that once shaped rest is reduced, and the body operates within a more controlled range of conditions. This does not mean that the body has lost its ability to adapt, but it suggests that adaptation is required less frequently during rest. Instead of responding to changes in temperature, surface, and environmental stimuli, the body is supported by a system that minimizes those changes. This support can make rest more consistent, but it also narrows the range of conditions under which sleep is regularly experienced. When we consider how this relates to the long period without beds, an important perspective emerges. The modern sleeping environment is not a continuation of the original human condition. It is a transformation of it, built on stability, repetition, and separation. The body, which once rested within a dynamic environment, now rests within a controlled one. This transformation is recent when viewed across the full timeline of human history, and it introduces new patterns of expectation and response. The absence of a bed for most of that timeline reflects a world in which such control was not possible and not necessary. The presence of a bed today reflects a different world, one in which the environment can be shaped to meet the needs of the body in a consistent way. Understanding this contrast is central to the question, because it shows that the bed is not simply an object that was eventually invented. It is part of a broader system that changes how the body relates to rest, replacing variability with stability and adaptation with expectation. As this controlled environment becomes more consistent across daily life, the body begins to organize its expectations of rest around repetition rather than variation. A specific surface, a familiar position, and a predictable sequence of actions leading into sleep gradually form a pattern that is reinforced night after night. The body does not need to interpret a wide range of environmental signals to determine when and how to rest. Instead, it relies on cues that are internally associated with a stable setting. The act of lying down on the same surface, in the same orientation, within a similar temperature and light condition, becomes a signal in itself. Over time, this signal strengthens, shaping how quickly the body can transition into rest and how deeply it can remain there. This pattern contrasts with earlier conditions, where the absence of consistency required the body to remain responsive to changing surroundings. Now, the surroundings are designed to remain constant, and the body adjusts to that constancy. This shift toward repetition also changes how the body responds when conditions differ from what it has come to expect. A surface that is uneven, a temperature that fluctuates, or a setting that lacks familiar cues may feel less suitable for rest, even if the body retains the capacity to adapt. The difference lies not in the body's fundamental ability, but in the narrowing of its routine experience. When most nights are spent under similar conditions, the range of what feels normal becomes more limited. This limitation does not appear immediately. It develops gradually, as the body learns to associate rest with a specific set of repeated factors. Over time, deviations from those factors may require a period of adjustment, reflecting the influence of expectation on the experience of sleep. In historical terms, this development aligns with the increasing stability of living environments. As settlements become more permanent and structures more durable, the conditions that support consistent sleep become easier to maintain. The bed, as a central element within this system, reinforces the idea that rest belongs to a particular place and follows a particular pattern. This reinforcement extends beyond the physical surface. It influences how time is organized, how daily routines are structured, and how the boundary between activity and rest is defined. Sleep becomes a scheduled event, anchored to a specific location, rather than a flexible state that emerges within changing conditions. Archaeological and historical records from later periods show how these patterns become more pronounced. Sleeping areas are separated from other parts of the living space, and the surfaces used for rest become more specialized. Materials are chosen not only for their availability, but for their ability to provide consistent support. The bed evolves into an object that is not only functional, but also symbolic of stability and personal space. It marks a point in the environment where rest is expected to occur, reinforcing the association between location and state. The body, in turn, adapts to this association, relying on it as part of the process of entering sleep. When we connect this to the broader timeline, the contrast becomes clearer. For most of human history, the body did not depend on such a narrow set of conditions. It could rest across a wide range of environments, responding to variation rather than expecting consistency. The introduction of a stable, repeatable surface changes this relationship. It reduces the need for adaptation and increases the role of expectation. This does not eliminate the body's ability to adjust, but it shifts the balance between flexibility and reliance. The absence of a bed in earlier periods reflects a world in which this balance was weighted toward flexibility. The presence of a bed today reflects a world in which stability and repetition have become central to how rest is organized. Understanding this shift helps clarify why beds did not appear earlier. It was not only a matter of materials or techniques, but of how life itself was structured. Without stability, repetition cannot be maintained. Without repetition, the body does not form the same expectations. And without those expectations, a fixed surface is not yet necessary. As this reliance on stable conditions deepens, the relationship between the body and rest begins to narrow in subtle ways. The surface remains the same, the environment remains controlled, and the sequence leading into sleep repeats with little variation. Over time, this repetition shapes not only expectation, but also sensitivity. Small differences that might once have been absorbed without difficulty can begin to stand out more clearly. A slight change in firmness, a variation in temperature, or a shift in surrounding sounds may feel more noticeable, not necessarily because they are more intense, but because they fall outside the range of what has become familiar. This growing sensitivity does not mean that the body has lost its capacity to adapt. Rather, it reflects a change in how often that capacity is used. When variation is reduced, the need for continuous adjustment decreases, and the body becomes more accustomed to operating within a narrow band of conditions. If we place this within the longer timeline of human history, the contrast becomes more pronounced. For most of that timeline, rest occurred within environments that were never entirely predictable. The body maintained a broader tolerance for variation because it encountered that variation regularly. In the present, where stability is more common, the range of everyday experience becomes more limited. The body still retains its underlying flexibility, but it is exercised less often during rest. This difference can influence how sleep is experienced when conditions change. In unfamiliar settings, where the surface or environment does not match the usual pattern, rest may feel less immediate or less continuous. The body requires time to adjust, not because it is incapable, but because its expectations have been shaped by repetition. This shift also affects how the boundary between rest and environment is perceived. A bed, combined with a controlled space, creates a clear separation. The body lies on a surface that is distinct from the ground, within an environment that is shielded from many external influences. This separation reduces the need to respond to changes beyond the immediate surface. In earlier conditions, that boundary was less defined. The body remained connected to the environment, adjusting to its variations as part of the resting process. Now, the environment is filtered, and the body interacts primarily with the controlled conditions that have been established. This filtering changes the balance between awareness and isolation during rest. Archaeological and historical developments reinforce this pattern. As sleeping surfaces become more refined and environments more controlled, the structure of rest becomes increasingly standardized. The bed is no longer just a surface. It becomes part of a system that organizes how and where sleep occurs, reinforcing consistency across time. This system supports continuity, allowing the body to remain in a stable position and a stable environment throughout the night. At the same time, it reduces exposure to the variability that once shaped rest. The body is no longer required to respond to the same range of external conditions, and the experience of sleep becomes more uniform as a result. When we consider this in relation to the long period without beds, a broader perspective emerges. The absence of a bed was not simply a lack of comfort or technology. It was part of a different relationship between the body and its surroundings, one in which rest remained integrated with environmental variation. The presence of a bed introduces a new relationship, where stability and repetition become central. This transition does not eliminate the body's original capacity to adapt, but it changes how often that capacity is engaged. Over time, the balance shifts toward reliance on controlled conditions, and the range of everyday experience becomes more focused. This does not lead to a clear conclusion about which form of rest is more effective. Instead, it highlights a transformation in how humans organize sleep in relation to their environment. For most of human history, rest occurred within a world that was constantly changing. In the present, it occurs within a world that is increasingly controlled. And within that change, the bed stands as a marker of how the relationship between the body and the ground has been gradually redefined. When we reach the present moment and look back across this long span of time, the absence of beds in most of human history begins to take on a different meaning. It is no longer simply a question of why something was missing, but of what conditions made it unnecessary. For a very long time, the body rested within environments that were variable, shared, and only partially controlled. The ground, with all its changes, provided enough support for rest to occur, and the body adapted to those conditions through continuous adjustment. Sleep was not separated from the world outside. It unfolded within it, shaped by temperature, surface, and the presence of others. In that context, the lack of a fixed, elevated surface did not prevent rest. It defined the way rest was experienced. As the environment became more stable and more controlled, the conditions that once made a bed unnecessary began to change. Surfaces could be shaped and maintained, spaces could be divided, and routines could be repeated. Within this new structure, the bed emerged not as a sudden invention, but as part of a broader transformation. It provided consistency, reduced variability, and created a clearer boundary between the body and its surroundings. Over time, this consistency became part of what the body expected, and the experience of rest adjusted accordingly. The ground, once the primary surface of sleep, was gradually replaced by constructed alternatives that offered greater stability. This transition did not erase the body's ability to adapt to less controlled conditions, but it shifted the balance toward reliance on a more predictable environment. When we consider what may have changed within this transition, the answer is not a single loss or gain, but a change in relationship. The body, which once responded continuously to a wide range of conditions, now operates within a narrower set of repeated circumstances. The variability that once shaped rest is reduced, and with it, the need for constant adjustment. This reduction can make sleep more consistent, but it also alters the way the body engages with its environment during rest. The connection between the body and the ground becomes indirect, filtered through layers of material and controlled space. The shared nature of resting space becomes less central, replaced by individual surfaces and defined boundaries. These changes reflect a broader shift in how humans organize their lives, moving from flexibility towards stability, from integration with the environment towards separation from it. Yet this shift does not fully replace what came before. The body still carries the capacity to rest under a range of conditions, shaped by a long history of adaptation. In unfamiliar settings, this capacity can reappear, allowing rest to occur even when the environment is not controlled. This suggests that the earlier form of rest has not disappeared entirely, but remains present beneath the patterns that have developed more recently. The bed, therefore, does not represent a complete departure from the past, but a layer added upon it, one that changes how rest is organized without entirely removing the underlying ability to adapt. When we return to the central question, the absence of beds for most of human history reflects a time when the conditions of life did not support or require a fixed surface for rest. The ground was sufficient, and the body was capable of working with it. As those conditions changed, the bed became possible and eventually common, but its emergence is tied to a broader transformation, one that extends beyond the surface itself. It reflects changes in movement, in settlement, in material use, and in how space is defined and maintained. Understanding this transformation allows us to see the bed not as an inevitable feature of human life, but as a response to a particular set of conditions that developed relatively late. And within that understanding, a quieter question remains, one that does not lead to a fixed conclusion, but invites reflection. If the human body learned to rest for so long without a bed, how much of that original flexibility still remains beneath the stability we now depend on? As this long transition comes into view, the meaning of comfort also begins to change. In the earliest settings of human life, comfort was not the removal of all difficulty. It was the presence of enough stability for rest to happen at all. A surface that was dry rather than wet, a place with less wind, a position closer to warmth, or the presence of others nearby could be enough to make sleep possible. These were not perfect conditions. They were sufficient conditions. Over time, as human environments became more stable, the meaning of comfort narrowed and became more specific. It came to involve softness, consistency, insulation, privacy, and the reduction of interruption. None of these are unnatural in themselves, but they belong to a later stage of human life, one in which the body is no longer resting inside the same range of uncertainty that shaped most of its earlier history. The bed becomes important within that later meaning of comfort, because it offers a level of control that the ground never could. Yet that control also changes what the body comes to expect. If a surface is always level, always dry, always separated from insects, moisture, and shifting ground, then rest becomes linked to those repeated conditions. The body settles more quickly into a familiar pattern, but it may also become less practiced at resting outside that pattern. This is not a dramatic loss, and it does not mean that modern sleep is somehow false. It simply means that one kind of adaptability is used less often. The older human body, shaped across very long stretches of time, did not depend on a fixed object to begin resting. It depended on the ability to adjust. That distinction matters, because it reminds us that the history of sleep is not only the history of increasing comfort, it is also the history of changing dependence. Archaeology does not tell us that the appearance of beds made human rest better in every sense, nor does it tell us that earlier rest was somehow ideal. What it shows more clearly is a shift in how surfaces were used and how living space became organized. A body that once lay within shared shifting environments gradually came to lie on defined repeatable structures. A place that was once chosen each night became a place prepared in advance. The ground that once held the body directly became something below the body, then something outside the room, then something almost absent from the experience of sleep altogether. This is not just a material change. It is a historical change in distance. Distance from the earth, distance from climate, distance from movement, and often distance from other people. When seen this way, the bed is not merely a piece of furniture. It is a record of how far human rest has moved from its original setting. And that setting was not simple comfort. It was exposure, adjustment, and enough safety to close the eyes for a while. So the deeper value of this history may not be in judging the present against the past, but in recognizing what kind of creature the human body originally was. One that could sleep without certainty, without private space, without a stable surface waiting each night. That older capacity may not define modern life anymore, but it still belongs to the story of the body we live in now. And perhaps that is why the question remains quietly powerful. If so much of human history passed without a bed, then when we lie down each night on a surface built to hold us perfectly still, are we resting in the final form of human sleep, or only in the newest layer placed over something much older? When we place the whole story side by side, a quieter truth begins to appear. For most of human history, the question was not how to create the perfect place to sleep, but how to rest within an imperfect world. The ground was uneven, the air changed, the night carried sound, temperature, moisture, and the presence of other living things. Human beings did not wait for those conditions to become ideal. They learned to rest within them, not because discomfort was good, but because adaptability was necessary. Much later, as settlement became stable and built space became more controlled, a different kind of sleep became possible. The body could be lifted from the ground, surfaces could remain in place, rooms could hold warmth, reduce disturbance, and separate rest from the changing world outside. From that long process, the bed emerged. It did not appear because humans had finally discovered what sleep truly needed. It appeared because human life itself had changed enough to make such a structure practical, repeatable, and meaningful. This matters because it helps us understand the bed in a more honest way. A bed is not the timeless center of human rest. It is a relatively recent solution to a relatively recent way of living. For that reason, the real lesson of this history is not that the past was better, or that the present is worse. The lesson is that the human body has a deeper history than the environment most of us now sleep in. That history was shaped by movement instead of permanence, by shared space instead of strict personal boundaries, by natural surfaces instead of engineered ones, and by flexibility instead of perfect consistency. To remember that is valuable because it places modern comfort in its proper scale. It becomes something humans built, not something humans were always meant to have. And once we see that, the title stops sounding like a strange absence. Why 90% of human history never had a bed becomes a clearer historical fact about how late the modern sleeping world really is. It also becomes a gentler reminder that many things we now treat as basic, obvious, or necessary are often products of very recent conditions, not the original design of the human story. That reminder has educational value beyond sleep. It teaches patience with the past. It teaches caution with easy conclusions about what is natural. And it teaches that the human body often carries old abilities long after the environment around it has changed. We do not need to romanticize ground sleeping to learn from that. We only need to recognize that for an immense stretch of time, rest was possible without softness, without elevation, without a private frame waiting in the dark. The body learned to sleep first, and the bed arrived much later. That order matters. It reminds us that civilization often refines life, but it also narrows certain forms of experience. Something is gained in comfort, stability, and protection. Something else may become quieter. The body's old familiarity with variability, its long practice of adjusting to the earth rather than being separated from it. Perhaps the most useful message, then, is a simple one. Human history is often easier to understand when we stop asking why earlier people lacked the things we have and start asking what kind of world made those things unnecessary for so long. In that slower way of looking, the bed becomes not just an object in a room, but a sign of how far human rest has travelled from its beginnings. And after following that path from open ground to raised surface, from shared darkness to controlled space, one final question remains resting quietly at the edge of the night. When the body lies down on a bed built by the modern world, how much of the older human world is still lying down with it?